Next up, we have Dr. Mathew Peirce. Dr. Mathew Peirce joined the Center of College Faculty in 2011. Before coming to the center, he spent extensive time in the Middle East and Central Asia, including living in Egypt, Yemen, and Iran. He was named a Center Scholar in 2016. Dr. Peirce specializes in medieval Islamic history and thought. His current research focuses on classical Arabic and Persian biographies, analyzing the production of cultural symbols related to gender, authority, and identity. His 2016 book, 12 Infallible Men, the Imams and the Making of Shiism, won international recognition when selected for Iran's Book of the Year award. We actually have limited copies of the book today. We encourage you to take a look at them, have a book signing, and purchase the copy. He is presently writing a biography of the 8th century scholar Imam Jafar as-Sadiq. Dr. Peirce has also contributed to the Princeton Encyclopedia of Islamic Political Thought in 2012, as well as an edited volume of Women, Leadership, and Mosques, Challenges in the Contemporary Islamic Authority. His work has also appeared in the Journal of Shia Islamic Studies. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Mathew Peirce with a loud salawat.
It's a pleasure to be here today. I want to start by thanking the organizers of the conference for inviting me to spend this time with you. It's an honor to be here. I hope to share a few thoughts with you today on this important topic, and I hope that what I have to share will be of some benefit to you, will be useful to you. In accepting the invitation to join you all today, I'm fully aware that I bring fewer years of experience than many of you have to thinking about this topic. It was only as an adult that some 15 years ago that I first began to study and think about the details of Imam's life and tragic death. And so again, I thank you for your kindness and generosity in inviting me. There are a number of ways in which I could approach the stories of Imam Hussain, each of which could be made into its own lecture. I could, for example, elaborate on my own personal encounter with the stories of Hussain and how they had impacted my own personal journey of faith. Myself, I grew up in a very conservative Christian environment that was very closed to the insights and contributions of other religious traditions. As a young adult, however, I began to study Islam and Islamic history, but it was only in 2003 when I moved to Iran to study for several years that I began to more deeply encounter the very powerful accounts of the life and death of Imam Hussain. And in the 3 years that I lived in Iran, the month of Muharram and the commemorations around Ashura were some of the most meaningful and treasured experiences that I had there. I found myself deeply moved by those encounters. Coming from a Christian background, and as many Christians have said before, and you've likely heard before, I couldn't help but immediately compare some of the stories of Hussain with what I knew about Jesus, the son of Mary. And I also felt like the stories of Hussain helped give me a different understanding of Jesus, one that shaped my own faith very profoundly. But if I were to delve into my own encounter with the stories of Hussain, as you can already tell, I would be telling you much more about myself than I would about Hussain or the stories of Hussain. My own personal thinking about Hussain, the lessons that I draw for myself from his life, and the meaning that I have found in those accounts are all very personal to me. They're very unique to my experiences. They're born out of the experiences that I've had. But by extension, this is really something that we can all say, that we all bring our own background, our own experiences to these stories when we hear them, when we read them. And our own backgrounds will affect how we understand them, what we believe about them, and what meaning we make out of them. And so, in the hopes of speaking more broadly on this topic, I would like to take a different approach to my main points today. An approach that will also draw on my own background, but in this case I want to draw on my background as a scholar of history and of religion, and as someone who has spent several years now reading and studying the Shia stories of the Imams. As mentioned last year, I published a book entitled 12 Infallible Men, the Imams and the Making of Shiism. But to the surprise of some, despite the title, the focus of the book is not actually on the historical lives of the 12 Imams. The book really, I argue, is not actually about the Imams at all. Rather, the research focused in that book is about the stories, the accounts, the biographies that Shia scholars through history have written about the Imams. Now, there's an important distinction here that I'm trying to make. The stories that people tell when they relate an account, when they tell a story, when they remember a story, how you tell that story, how anyone tells that story, will tell you something about that person, their background, their interest, what's meaningful to them. We all tell stories that are meaningful to us, that shape, that make sense of our world, our struggles in the world, stories that we recognize basic truths about the world and ourselves. And so in my book, I wanted to write a work that looked at those classical Shia accounts of the Imams' lives in an effort to think about what we can learn about the authors of those books, the communities, the Shia communities through history that wrote those books. I focused my research there on texts written between the 10th and 12th centuries, especially the works of Sheikh Mufid, Fadl bin Hassan al-Tabrizi, and Ibn Shahrashub. This period, 10th to 12th centuries of the Common Era of Shiism, was basically after the beginning of the greater occultation, Baqaiba, of the 12th Imam, up to the end of the Seljuk period. It was a very critical time of history for the development of Twelver Shiism. Many of the ways that the Imams were talked about, how the Imams were remembered, how they were honored, how they were mourned, took shape in that period. And Shiism, as a school of thought, as it was beginning to really crystallize in that period, was also simultaneously increasingly being excluded from centers of power and influence. The scholars who wrote about the lives of the Imams drew on previous generations of accounts of the Imams and retold those stories in new ways that helped build community, helped encourage piety, helped cultivate a love for the Prophet's family. And so I come to you today, and I expect that the reason I was invited to speak at this conference, I come with some expertise in the history of how these stories have taken shape, how they've been told over generations, and the development therein. In my time with you, I'd like to make a few short observations about the history of the stories about Imam Hussain, especially in the early development of Shiism, and then I'll close by stepping back to make a few of my own comments on this conversation and the many inspirations that might be drawn from the accounts of Imam Hussain relating to issues of social injustices, racial oppression, and economic injustices. Now, taking the time to appreciate the historical development across time of these accounts and biographies of any important person, it's a challenging endeavor. It's never simple. It's never straightforward. And there are always contentious debates when you're talking about religious figures of any point in history. I am currently also mentioned working on a new book where I'm attempting to write a biography of Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq. It's been exciting. It's been personally rewarding. It's also very challenging to make sense of the many different stories about his life. But I come to you today that I'd like to suggest 3 observations about the general development about the stories of Imam Hussain. So, observation number one. In the first 100 years after the death of Imam Hussain, this earliest stage of development of stories about the Imam, the accounts of Hussein's martyrdom were primarily, I would argue, applied and told in relationship to a call for justice and a call for love. And let me elaborate on this point. When identifying the earliest accounts of Hussein's life and death, which is not an easy task, and I won't bore you with the details of early Arab Muslim historiography, but suffice it to say that these early accounts were all passed on orally. It was a century later before these accounts began to be written down into texts, into books. They were passed on from teacher to student. So the attempt to recover these early accounts from that first 100 years after the Imam Hussein's death, you have to read the written texts and then look and see where they came from. What were the sources used? Upon whom did they quote? Where were these stories derived? And in so making my observations here of this first century of stories about Imam Hussain, I am, in addition to my own work, drawing upon the work of I.K.A. Howard and Antoine Bourroud. It seems that in that first 100 years, there were two main cities in which the stories of Hussain were primarily, popularly being told. And if you know the history of early Shiism, you might be able to guess this was primarily in the city of Medina and in Kufa. But I would argue that the application being drawn from these stories in each of these cities differed slightly, at least in emphasis. The reasons people told them in each location was somewhat different for different purposes. In Medina, you obviously had the descendants of Hussain, especially Imam Sajjad Zain al-Abidin, Imam Baqir, as well as Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq. And they told their students about the stories of Hussein's sacrifice. In Kufa, however, you had many prominent followers of these imams. You had many supporters of a very wide array, supporters of the Ahlul Bayt. They had received these stories somewhat from the family of Hussein, but also their own stories, from their own families, from their experiences. Although the Ahlul Bayt supporters in Kufa were obviously tied to those in Medina in important ways, and there was some overlap in the narrative perspectives, it's also fair to say that the concerns of the imams in Medina were not always the same as the concerns or political perspectives of even some of their own followers who lived in Kufa. Compared to the stories about Hussein that were circulating in Kufa, especially his martyrdom, the stories of Hussein in Medina were shorter, and I would argue more intimate. Taking, for example, if we try to isolate the accounts that seem to come from Imam Baqir and Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, if we take those out, isolate them, and look at them on their own, they tend to focus on Hussein's relationship to the Prophet and on the value of remembering Hussein and visiting his grave. In my opinion, the theme of those accounts that comes out most prominently is a theme of love. And here I don't mean love in the abstract, and I don't mean romantic love, but rather a very specific familial bond of love that extends from the Ahlul Bayt to the community as well. The many stories of the Prophet's love for Hassan and Hussein, as well as Hussein's intimacy with his father, Ali, and his mother, Fatima, continually reinforce the loving bond between his family. In the accounts they encourage remembering Hussein and visiting his grave, and thereby also encouraged the followers of Ahlul Bayt to love Hussein, to love his family, as they would their own family. In my own reading of this period, the history of that time in history, the reasons I believe that Imams Bakr and Sadiq were inclined to emphasize this particular theme of love of the Prophet's family when talking about Hussein may have had to do with the idea of walaya. As numerous scholars have noted, this doctrine of walaya was one of the key doctrinal developments of this time in history. You might translate walaya as allegiance, perhaps spiritual allegiance, devotion. There are many. There's a lot of breadth to the term. It was not a new term. It had been around, but the Imams Bakr and Sadiq were applying this term in new ways and expanding on it. They were applying walaya not just to Ali, not just to a devotion to Ali, but a devotion to the entire Ahlul Bayt, to Ali's descendants. And they elevated this doctrine of walaya to being one of the critical, important doctrines, that this spiritual allegiance or devotion or commitment to the Ahlul Bayt was for them something essential. The stories that they told of Hussein helped make sense, make this sensible, make it compelling. Hussein became a key symbol of the inherited authority of Ali's descendants. He was a powerfully compelling figure, inspired devotion and commitment. Walaya was a devotion undergirded by love for the Prophet, love for his family, and commitment to them. And the stories of Medina about Hussein helped make the Prophet's love for him clear and encouraged the audience to love Hussein as well. Now, back in Kufa, at the same time period, this first century after Hussein's death, the driving concerns, the pressing concerns, were more overtly political. Grievances against Umayyad rule was pervasive in the city. Many non-Arabs felt discriminated against. Support for Ali had been strong, and the remorse for not coming to Hussein's aid lingered for generations. In the aftermath of the tragedy at Karbala, many Kufans had lost their lives rebelling against the Umayyads. And so for many people in Kufa, there was a great interest in the details of Hussein's death, his suffering, and clear narratives that highlighted the injustices inflicted upon him. The most palpable, recurring theme in those stories out of Kufa, I would argue, was the issue of justice. Here again, I don't mean justice in the abstract, but a concrete worldly justice. The stories of Hussein, for many Kufans, was an indictment of the political order that perpetuated systemic injustices. The violence that the Umayyads had used against Hussein was meant to expose the oppressive nature of Umayyad rule, and they helped build support for anyone who might stand up to the Umayyads in an effort to bring about a more just political order. It's worth noting in this time period as well, one particular Kufan scholar who became very important for the narratives about Hussein, Abu Mikhnaf, who collected a wide array of accounts about Hussein's martyrdom. He was a contemporary of Ja'far al-Sadiq, and he assembled a continuous, detailed account of the events at Karbala. He wrote this in a book at that time period, Maqtal al-Hussein, which was eventually lost to history. We don't have this text any longer, but many scholars in subsequent centuries drew heavily from this book, including Sheikh Mufid, which I'll come back to in a moment. And so his book was incredibly influential for later Shia communities. Abu Mikhnaf himself was strongly anti-Umayyad and clearly saw the horrific violence used against Hussein to be an indictment against the Umayyads. So again, let me restate my first point, that in that first 100 years after Hussein's death, the stories that were circulated about him primarily focused on love for the Prophet and his family, and on justice, political justice in particular. Now, observation number 2. subsequent centuries, particularly from the 9th to 12th centuries, which was primarily during the Abbasid period, if you remember your history, stories of Hussein were increasingly used as the central narrative that defined Shi'ism. Baghdad at that time was growing into a new center of intellectual power in the world, and a new generation of Shia scholars were beginning to interpret and teach about what it meant to be a follower of the 12 Imams in the age of Qayba. The stories of Hussein were less frequently used for political protest and increasingly used alongside the stories of other Imams to cultivate an understanding of the Imamate, the whole Imamate. The famous Sheikh Mufid was a pivotal scholar for this period and this transition. This transition did not occur overnight. It was a gradual transition. The early Abbasids did clearly often perceive the Shia and the Imams to be, the Imams' followers to be a threat. Famously, the Abbasid Caliph Mutawakkil in the 9th century had Hussein's tomb entirely destroyed in order to prevent people from visiting it. But, and in that context, the story of Hussein continued to be, for a time, a source of political protest and a source of protest for the lineage of Ali against the lineage of the Abbasids. But times were changing. Political contexts were changing. Social contexts were changing. And by the 10th century, the 12th Imam had been in occultation for some time. There had been new leadership in Baghdad that was quite favorable to and sympathetic with Shi'ism. And people like Sheikh Mufid were taking on a new perspective on the texts. When Sheikh Mufid wrote his Kitab al-Irshad, he drew extensively on Kufan stories of Hussein's death, especially Abu Mikhnaf, as I mentioned before. But for Mufid, these narratives he placed them in this book, this Kitab al-Irshad, that was about all 12 Imams. The stories of Hussein within the context of that book become the emotional focal point of the book. But it was not framed as a political protest. Rather, it was used to give meaning and sense to the lives of all 12 Imams. Through Hussein, one could understand better all of the Imams. So, interestingly, prior to Sheikh Mufid, most Shia biographies, and I found this fascinating in my research, most Shia biographers of the Imams prior to Sheikh Mufid would have spent more time writing about Imam Ali, Imam Baqir, Imam Sadiq, Imam Ali Rida, and the Mahdi. Hussein was not the Imam they wrote the most about, just volume-wise, the amount of attention they spent on him. But Sheikh Mufid spent more time on Hussein's death in his Kitab al-Irshad than any other single topic in the text. And it became this focal point of the book. It had a tremendous impact on how the book was felt and understood. Most Shia scholars after Mufid, scholars like At-Tabrizi, Ibn Shahr-Shub, who wrote books that expanded on Mufid's teachings, they followed his lead and placed Hussein as the main topic around which other Imams could be partly understood. Put more simply, the stories of Hussein were increasingly used for teaching about all of the Imams and about how the Imams' followers, that is the Shia, might best cultivate devotion to the Imams. The suffering of Hussein was now less about political protest as it was about helping the Shia feel compassion and love and devotion to the Imams and the Prophet's family. It would help inspire commitments to living according to their teachings. In this process, Hussein's martyrdom was becoming a central unifying symbol for those who followed all of the Imams. Mourning for Hussein was ritualized and theatrically reenacted to teach and to educate. The steady increase in popular Shia focus on Hussein as a symbol for Shiism reached its height in the Safavid period. In the biographies of imams written by scholars like Alame Majlisi in the 17th century, the accounts of Hussein are far, far more extensive than any of the other imams. This went hand in hand with Majlisi's active interest in making the Safavid Empire a uniquely Shia empire. So again, you see this recurring theme of changing times shifts the focus of how people tell the story, why they tell the story, and what applications they are drawing from it. And so this brings me to my third point, and then I'll close. That in the modern period, the stories of Hussein have been increasingly varied in how they are told, represented in a diversity of cultures like never before, and increasingly applied to a wider scope of purposes. Now, you might be able to recognize that my own research specialty is in the pre-modern period, so I've made very specific comments about the 7th century and the 10th century, and I'm going to make a sweeping generalization about the modern period. But if we had the time to look more closely at the books written about Hussein in, for example, the Safavid period, and then in early modern India, in colonial Trinidad, in contemporary Europe and the United States, we could tease this point out more carefully, but for the sake of brevity, and at the risk of stating the obvious, we can note that the variety of applications of Hussein's story and the lessons that have been drawn from his life are unprecedented in Shia history. When people in new social and political contexts in different places in the world encounter and retell the stories of Hussein, they do so with new lessons that have been drawn from Hussein's life and death. And this conference, I would argue, is a very testament to this point. So what are we to make of this? What's the point? Why does this matter? Now, in my academic research and in my book, 12 Infallible Men, for example, I argue that paying attention to how these stories change in ways they show us and tell us something about how we understand religion, the history of Shiism, and the human search for meaning. I think we can learn a great deal about watching how these change over time. If we take those comments that I made at the beginning of this talk seriously, that a person telling a story tells us as much about that person as anything else, then we can learn a great deal about Muslim communities through history by paying attention to how these stories are told. And for that approach, if you're interested in that kind of subject matter, you can see my book outside. But as I conclude my time here today, I want to draw out a different lesson from these observations. And here, for a moment, I'm allowing myself to speak as a person of faith, in addition to an academic. One of the things that has stood out to me regarding the history of Shia stories of the Imams, and of Hussein in particular, has been the emphasis on the moral and ethical truths that can be learned from the lives of the Imams, rather than an emphasis on historicity of every story. Now, I'm not saying that Shia scholars have not concerned themselves with historicity, trying to discern what actually historically happened, whether it's the events of Karbala or any other event in the lives of the Imams, clearly has been a concern. But I would contend that the arguments over historicity have been emphasized more in the modern period than they were in previous periods. But an example of this, the great Iranian scholar of the 20th century, Shahid Mutahhari, was just recently reading a sermon that he gave where he very clearly elaborated on his concerns that some of the stories about Hussein were not historically accurate, and for him that was a very important point, and he went to great lengths to talk about that concern. So historicity has been and is a concern for Shia scholars. But that being said, it is not a contradiction to also observe that the moral truths of stories have often been of greater interest to Shia scholars through history than the historicity question. By moral truths here, I mean the ethical lessons that we learn about the nature of the world, about the nature of humanity, and about the greatest potentials for humanity in this world. In many cases, attempting to determine for certain whether a particular story did or did not happen will not turn up any conclusive answer. It's hard to say in many cases, for sure. Now, I don't know of any scholars that deny that Hussein and his companions were killed at Karbala, But the details of that event are difficult to verify with certainty for historians. But I would like to suggest to you that focusing on trying to determine historical truth of an account can actually distract from the moral truth. As I step back and look at the history of stories about Hussein, I'm struck by the fact that his life and death have been profoundly meaningful and inspirational to people across history and across the world. The most powerful truths of Hussein's life may not be the historicity issue, but the moral truths that those story captures. The fact that people across the world have been inspired by Hussein to stand up for justice, to stand against oppression, to spread love to others, that reality, the fact that they have found it so meaningful for that, speaks to the moral truths inherent in the accounts of his life. Religious traditions across the world form around stories of great people, prophets, saints, imams, precisely because the accounts of their lives resonate with the intuitive moral vision that we have within us. It is the very widespread and diverse popularity of stories of Hussein that confirm for us the moral veracity of the accounts. Historians will always quibble about the details, about what really happened and what did not. But the veracity of the moral integrity and ethical reliability of the life of Hussein will not be judged by the scholars. It will be judged by the community. The act of finding inspiration in the life of Hussein, inspiration to fight injustice, to love, to resist racial oppression, all of those things, these are the ongoing testaments to Hussein's life that matter most. And as the memory of Hussein is championed, as long as the memory of Hussein is championed for the rights of the oppressed, the story of Hussein remains as true and powerful as ever. Thank you.